A tall Apache arrived at his ranch with a truth he couldn't ignore. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. Thomas stood frozen, staring at the pendant in the Apache man's hand. His heart raced as memories began to stir, long-buried fragments of a past he had tried so hard to forget. The truth that this man spoke of was something Thomas wasn't ready to confront. He had chosen to bury his past, to live quietly in isolation, away from the pain of lost family and broken promises. But now, it seemed that the past had come knocking at his door. The Apache man stepped closer, his tall frame casting a long shadow over Thomas. There was a solemnity in his eyes, an understanding that Thomas could not ignore. The truth, the Apache man said, his voice low and steady, is that you saved my life many years ago. And now, I've come to repay the debt. But it's not just any debt. It's a debt that stretches far beyond what you understand. Thomas swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. He had no memory of saving anyone, let alone this man standing before him. His mind raced, searching for answers, but they eluded him. The pendant felt heavy in his hand, and he knew that it was the key to unlocking the truth. Who are you? Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. The Apache man's gaze softened. My name is Takakota, he replied. I am the son of the chief of the Redstone Apache. The day you saved me, I was a boy, lost and near death, trapped in a ravine by the raging river. You pulled me out of the water and carried me to safety. You didn't ask for anything in return, and that act of kindness has shaped my life ever since. Thomas's heart sank as Takakota's words slowly sank in. He had never realized the impact of that single act of kindness. He had been so consumed by his own grief and pain that he never thought about the people whose lives he had touched. Takakota's face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that spoke of respect and gratitude, but also a deep weight of responsibility. I've returned today not just to thank you, Takakota continued, but to ask for your help once again. The Redstone Apache are in danger. There are men who are trying to take our land, to destroy our way of life. And I believe you can help us stop them. Thomas's chest tightened as Takakota's words settled into his mind. The ranch he had worked so hard to build was all he had left in this world, but it was clear that his connection to the Apache ran deeper than he had ever known. He had no idea how much the past had shaped the present, or how much the present would change his future. Takakota paused, looking directly at Thomas. I came to you because you owe me nothing, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But we owe each other more than you realize. You saved my life, and now, it is my turn to ask you to save something greater. The Redstone Apache need you. For a long moment, Thomas was silent. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He had spent so many years trying to escape his past, but here it was, right in front of him. He had a choice to make. He could turn away and return to his lonely life, or he could stand by the Apache people and fight for something greater than himself. Slowly, Thomas took a deep breath and nodded. What do you need me to do? He asked, his voice steady. Takakota's eyes flickered with a mixture of relief and resolve. We must ride to the heart of the conflict, he said. Together, we will face the men who threaten my people. We cannot do it alone. As they rode together into the sunset, Thomas felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. The weight of the past no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a call to action. This was a fight he couldn't ignore, and he wasn't alone. The journey ahead would be long and dangerous, but for the first time in many years, Thomas felt ready to face it. The past had found him, and now, he was ready to fight for a future that was worth living. The journey had begun under the heavy weight of the setting sun, with the vast, open plains stretching out before Thomas and Takakota. Thomas had left behind the life he had spent years building, his quiet ranch, the loneliness that had kept him company for so long. Now, with Takakota at his side, they rode toward a future that Thomas couldn't have imagined, a future that felt both uncertain and filled with promise. They rode through the night, the cool evening air brushing against their faces, and the rhythmic sound of hooves was the only thing that accompanied their thoughts. They didn't speak much, the weight of their mission too heavy to be broken by idle conversation. Takakota seemed to understand, his eyes always scanning the horizon as if looking for signs of danger. Thomas could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as if the very land itself was waiting for something to change. By the time they reached the outskirts of the Redstone Apache camp, the first light of dawn was breaking. The camp was a stark contrast to the stillness of the desert around it. Tents were set up in neat rows, and a few Apache warriors were already awake, preparing for the day ahead. The smell of smoke from the campfire mixed with the scent of fresh earth, a reminder that these people had lived in harmony with the land for generations. Takakota led Thomas through the camp with a quiet confidence, nodding to the warriors who passed by. They had already heard of Thomas's arrival, and there was a sense of respect in the air as they watched him. He felt like a stranger here, but somehow, it didn't seem to matter. He wasn't just a man who had lived alone for years. He was a man who had saved the life of their leader's son, and that was enough. Takakota led Thomas to the center of the camp, where the chief awaited them. The chief was an older man, his face lined with the wisdom of years spent leading his people through both peace and conflict. His presence was commanding, and even without speaking, his gaze seemed to hold a deep understanding of the situation at hand. Takakota introduced Thomas to the chief, and the two men exchanged a firm handshake. There was no need for words at first. The chief studied Thomas, as if measuring him not just with his eyes, but with his spirit. "You've come to help us," the chief said finally, his voice deep and steady. "But do you understand what it is you're truly stepping into?" Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. He had come to help, to repay a debt, but the truth of the situation was much bigger than he had realized. The chief motioned for Thomas to sit, and the warriors gathered around them in a circle, all eyes fixed on him. The chief began to speak, his words painting a picture of the Redstone Apache's plight. The land they had lived on for generations was now under threat. White settlers, driven by greed and backed by the local government, were trying to seize their territory. The Apache had been pushed to the brink, and now they were fighting not just for their land, but for their way of life. Thomas listened intently, his heart heavy with the weight of their struggle. He had never truly understood the hardships the Apache faced. To him, they had always been the other, a people defined by their differences. But as he sat there, hearing their story, he realized how little he knew, how much he had been blind to. The chief's voice grew stronger as he spoke of the battles that had already been fought, of the lives that had been lost. "We cannot win this fight alone," the chief said. "We need your help, Thomas Davis. You have the skills, the knowledge of this land, and most importantly, you have the heart to fight with us." Thomas looked around at the faces of the warriors, all of them waiting for his response. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him, but he also felt something else, something that had been missing for years. He felt needed. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt as though his life had a purpose beyond his own sorrow. "I'll help," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I don't know what I can do, but I will do whatever it takes." The chief nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "That is all we ask," he said. As the warriors began to prepare for the coming battle, Thomas stood up, his heart racing with anticipation. He was no longer just a man haunted by his past. He was a part of something much larger than himself, something worth fighting for. Together, they would face the coming storm. And Thomas was ready. The past had led him here, to this moment. And now, it was time to fight for a future he never thought possible. The morning was cold, the air sharp with the promise of a coming storm. Thomas stood with Takakota and the chief, surrounded by warriors preparing for the battle that would define the future of the Redstone Apache. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the camp, and the stillness of the dawn felt like a moment suspended in time. The warriors were calm, methodical in their movements, as if they had done this 100 times before. But Thomas could sense the tension in the air, the weight of what was at stake. As he looked around, he saw the faces of men and women who had known hardship, loss, and sacrifice. They were united by a common purpose, to protect their land, their people, and their way of life. The chief spoke again, his voice low but filled with authority. "We will not back down," he said. "The land is ours, and we will fight to keep it. but we need all the help we can get. Thomas, you know this land better than any of us. You have the experience. We need your knowledge to guide us." Thomas nodded, his mind racing. He had spent his entire life working this land, learning its every curve and shift, its hidden dangers and quiet beauty. But he had never thought he would be using that knowledge to fight for someone else's survival. He wasn't sure he was ready for what lay ahead, but he knew one thing. He couldn't turn back. The war was coming, and he had already made his choice. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the warriors began to gather their weapons and gear. Takakota turned to Thomas, his expression serious. "The settlers will come soon. They will bring soldiers, guns, and men who know how to fight. But we have the land, and we have the spirit. We will not give up without a fight." Thomas clutched his rifle tightly, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He had never been one for violence, but there was a fire in his chest now, a resolve he hadn't known existed. He would not let these people, these warriors, face this battle alone. As the group made their way to the edge of the camp, Thomas could feel the tension building. The wind had picked up, rustling the dry grass and stirring the dust into the air. In the distance, he could see the outline of the approaching settlers' camp. The horses were visible now, their riders moving in a tight formation. "They're coming," Takakota said quietly. Thomas could see the grim determination in the Apache warriors' faces. They were ready, but they knew the fight ahead would be brutal. The land was wide and open, and there would be no place to hide. It would be a battle of endurance and will, one that could only be won with the strength of their hearts and the fire of their spirits. As they took their positions, Thomas felt a sense of finality settle over him. He was no longer just a rancher, a man trying to escape his past. He was part of something much bigger now, something worth fighting for. He wasn't just fighting for the Apache. He was fighting for the future, for the chance to build something better, something that would last. As the settlers approached, Thomas felt his heart pound in his chest. He was ready. The battle for the land, for the people, and for the future had begun, and he would stand beside the Apache, no matter the cost. The first shots rang out across the field, sharp and sudden, breaking the silence of the morning. The battle had begun. The sound of gunfire echoed across the wide plains as the battle raged on. Thomas crouched low behind a boulder, his rifle steady in his hands. The settlers were coming in waves, armed with rifles and determination, but the Apache warriors were holding their ground. Takakota had led them into the thick of it, and now they were defending their land with everything they had. Thomas's heart raced as he peered over the rock, watching the chaos unfold. The Apache were skilled fighters, moving with precision and purpose, but the settlers were relentless. Every shot from his rifle seemed to be answered by a volley of gunfire, each explosion of sound filling the air with the promise of violence. He had never imagined himself in a fight like this, but now there was no turning back. As the battle wore on, Thomas could feel the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The violence, the bloodshed, it was all a far cry from the peaceful life he had once known. But this was no longer just about his past. It was about survival. It was about standing alongside Takakota and the Apache people, fighting for the future of the land they had lived on for centuries. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh light across the battlefield. Sweat dripped down Thomas's brow, his hands slick with the effort of reloading and firing. The Apache warriors fought with fierce determination, their war cries echoing through the valley. The settlers, though outnumbered, were not giving up easily. Thomas could see the fear in their eyes as they fell one by one, but they kept advancing, driven by the belief that this land belonged to them. Takakota moved with the warriors, his eyes locked on the enemy, his movements precise and deadly. He had proven himself time and again, leading his people with the courage of a lion. But even he could not hold off the onslaught forever. As the hours passed, the Apache began to lose ground. The settlers had the advantage of numbers, and their relentless push was wearing down the defenders. Takakota's warriors fought bravely, but they were being overwhelmed. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Takakota take a direct hit. The Apache leader fell to the ground, his rifle slipping from his hands. A roar of anger surged through Thomas, and without thinking, he sprang from his cover, charging toward Takakota. His rifle cracked with deadly accuracy, dropping two settlers in quick succession. But the battle was far from over. As he reached Takakota's side, Thomas knelt down, his hands shaking as he checked the Apache leader's wounds. Takakota groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "You're not done yet," Thomas said, his voice low but steady. Takakota managed a weak smile. "Neither are you," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas helped him to his feet, supporting the Apache leader as they retreated toward the back lines. The Apache were regrouping, their warriors slowly falling back, but they were far from defeated. Takakota's presence was a symbol of hope, and as long as he was alive, they would continue to fight. But Thomas knew they were running out of time. The settlers were closing in, and they needed to strike back before it was too late. With Takakota by his side, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of the battle. "We need to hit them hard," he said, his voice full of resolve. "While they're distracted, we can take them by surprise." Takakota nodded weakly, his strength returning with each passing moment. Together, they rallied the Apache warriors, ready to make one final stand. The settlers would learn that they could not take what did not belong to them. As the Apache warriors regrouped, the air grew thick with anticipation. The land was theirs, and they would fight for it until their last breath. Thomas and Takakota shared a look of understanding, two men bound by a common cause, ready to face whatever came next. They charged once more into the fray, their rifles raised and their spirits undeterred. This was more than a battle for land. It was a fight for honor, for survival, and for the future of the Apache people. The settlers had underestimated them, and now the Apache would make them pay the price. The battle raged on, the sound of gunfire and war cries filling the air. Thomas and Takakota had led their forces in a final push, but the settlers were not backing down. The land they fought for, the lives of their people, were on the line, and neither side was willing to yield. As the Apache warriors pressed forward, Thomas could feel the weight of the struggle in his bones. He had never imagined himself in the thick of such a conflict. But here he was, fighting beside men and women who had more at stake than he could have ever understood. They were fighting not just for land, but for their survival, for the future of their children, and for the honor of their ancestors. Takakota, though wounded and weary, was leading the charge with unwavering determination. His strength seemed to inspire the warriors around him, and the Apache forces surged forward with renewed vigor. But Thomas knew they couldn't keep up this pace for long. The settlers were relentless, their numbers seemed endless, and they had more firepower. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Thomas saw the tide of battle begin to shift. The Apache were losing ground, the settlers pushing them back inch by inch. Takakota was still fighting at the front, but his movements had slowed, his strength waning. Thomas could see the concern in the eyes of the Apache warriors, and he knew they were beginning to doubt their ability to win. It was at that moment that Thomas made a decision. He had to act, and he had to act fast. He looked around, searching for the opening he needed, and then he spotted it. A small group of settlers trying to flank the Apache forces from the east. Without hesitation, Thomas signaled to Takakota. "We have to stop them before they reach the others," he shouted. Takakota nodded, and together, they led a small group of warriors toward the eastern flank. The sound of hooves pounding the earth filled the air as they rode, their rifles raised and ready. As they neared the group of settlers, Thomas's heart raced. This was it, the final stand. The settlers didn't see them coming until it was too late. The Apache warriors charged in with a fury, catching the settlers off guard. Gunshots rang out, but the Apache were faster, more agile. Within moments, the small group of settlers was overwhelmed, and Thomas and Takakota stood victorious. But the battle was far from over. As they turned to return to the main fight, they saw the true scale of the conflict. The Apache forces were still being pushed back, and the settlers had begun to regroup. Takakota turned to Thomas, his face grim. "We cannot let them win," he said. "This is our land. This is our future." Thomas nodded, his mind made up. He had seen enough. He couldn't back down now. Together, with Takakota at his side, they rallied the Apache forces for one final charge. The settlers were scattered and disorganized from the surprise attack, and the Apaches seized their moment. They moved with speed and precision, pushing the settlers back and reclaiming the land they had fought so hard to protect. But just as the Apache forces began to turn the tide, a loud shout rang out from the opposite side of the battlefield. Thomas turned to see a group of settlers, led by a man who had been overseeing the battle from the rear, charging directly at Takakota. The man's face was twisted with anger, and he raised his rifle, aiming straight at Takakota. Without thinking, Thomas rushed forward, firing his rifle just in time to stop the man. The bullet struck the man's shoulder, knocking him off his horse, but it wasn't enough to stop the assault. The settlers had seen the distraction and were advancing once again. Takakota, seeing the opportunity, rallied the Apache warriors for a final push. With a roar, they surged forward, overwhelming the settlers in a wave of fury and determination. The settlers, exhausted and outnumbered, began to retreat, and within moments, the battlefield was theirs. Thomas stood amidst the chaos, his breath heavy and his heart pounding. The battle had been won, but at a great cost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Apache warriors celebrated their victory, but there was no joy in Thomas's heart. They had won the land, but the cost of the battle had been steep. Takakota approached him, his face showing both relief and sadness. "We have won today," he said, "but the war is far from over." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The fight for the future of the Apache was far from over, but for now, they had won. And that was enough. The battlefield was quiet now, but the air was thick with the weight of the victory. Thomas stood in the midst of the Apache warriors, his rifle still in his hand, his body tired and sore from the relentless fight. The settlers had retreated, their forces scattered, but the cost of the battle was clear. The Apache had held their ground, but many had fallen in the process. Takakota approached him, his face solemn, but there was a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. "We did it," Takakota said, his voice low. "But the price was high." Thomas nodded, his heart heavy. He had never imagined that he would find himself here, fighting for a cause that wasn't his own. But the Apache had become his people, and their struggle was now his. They had won the land, for now, but the fight was far from over. The settlers were not easily defeated, and the Apache knew that their enemies would return, perhaps with greater numbers, more firepower. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the battlefield, the Apache warriors gathered to honor their fallen. Thomas watched them, feeling the weight of their grief and their resolve. These people had lost so much, yet they fought on, with a fierce pride that seemed unbreakable. Takakota walked over to a small fire, where a group of warriors were preparing the fallen for their final rites. The ceremony was simple but powerful, a reminder of the deep connection the Apache had to their land and their ancestors. As the warriors chanted, Thomas felt a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in years. The pain of his past, the loss of his family, the solitude he had chosen for so long, it all seemed to fade away in the presence of these people. They had fought for something greater than land. They had fought for their way of life, their culture, their future. And in that moment, Thomas realized that he was a part of that. Takakota turned to him, his expression hardening. "We won today, but the settlers will return. They won't give up so easily," he said. Thomas met his gaze, understanding the gravity of his words. The war was not over. It had only just begun. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked. Takakota's face softened slightly. "Now we prepare," he said. "We rebuild, we train, and we wait. When they return, we will be ready." The days that followed were filled with hard work. The Apache warriors worked tirelessly to reinforce their camp, repairing weapons, mending shelters, and gathering supplies. Thomas joined them, his skills as a rancher now invaluable. He helped them build defenses, setting traps along the outer edges of their land, and training the warriors in the art of survival in the harsh terrain. As the weeks passed, Thomas became more integrated into the Apache way of life. He learned their language, their customs, and their history. He came to understand the deep bond they shared with the land, a bond that went beyond mere ownership. It was a spiritual connection, a living, breathing relationship with the earth that had sustained them for generations. Takakota became a mentor to Thomas, teaching him not only how to fight, but also how to lead. "A leader is not one who commands," Takakota told him one evening as they sat by the fire. "A leader is one who listens, who understands the needs of his people. You must know them, their fears, their hopes, their dreams. Only then can you guide them." Thomas took these words to heart, realizing that he had much to learn. He had spent so many years focused on his own grief, his own loss, that he had never stopped to truly listen to those around him. But now, he had a purpose. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man fighting for a future. Days turned into weeks, and the Apache warriors grew stronger. The settlers, as Takakota had predicted, began to regroup. Rumors spread of reinforcements arriving from other territories, of new settlers seeking to claim the land. But Thomas and the Apache were ready. The next battle would be the true test of their strength, their unity, and their resolve. As the night sky stretched above them, the Apache gathered around the fire, their faces lit by the flickering flames. Thomas stood among them, no longer a stranger. He had found his place, his purpose, in the fight for a land that was more than just soil and stone. It was home, and he would defend it with everything he had. The days leading up to the next battle felt like a storm waiting to break. The Apache warriors, though battle-tested and strong, were restless. They had fought hard to reclaim their land, but they knew the settlers wouldn't stay defeated for long. Thomas felt the weight of the coming conflict pressing down on him as he trained with the warriors, honing his skills, learning their ways. The warriors had taken him in as one of their own, but even now, as he walked among them, he could still sense the distance, the gap between someone who had grown up with this culture and someone who had been thrust into it out of necessity. Takakota had noticed it too. The two men had grown close over the past few weeks, and though they had forged a bond of mutual respect, there were still moments when Takakota looked at Thomas as if waiting for him to prove himself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Takakota approached him while they were both sitting by the fire. "Thomas," he began, his voice low and steady. "Tomorrow, the settlers will come again. They will come with more men, more weapons, and more determination than before. We will be tested, but we will not fail. Not with you by our side." Thomas looked up at Takakota, the firelight flickering in his eyes. He nodded, but a knot formed in his chest. He had fought in many battles, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for land. This was a fight for survival, for culture, for people who had been driven to the brink of extinction. He was no longer just fighting for a cause he had been swept into. He was fighting for a future that belonged to these people. The night before the battle, the warriors gathered in the center of the camp. The chief stood at the head of the circle, his voice carrying across the camp. "Tomorrow, we fight not just for our land, but for our way of life. We fight for our ancestors who walked this land before us. We fight for our children, so they will know the same freedom and pride we have known." The words struck deep within Thomas. He had heard many speeches in his life, but none that resonated like this one. He had seen the pain in Takakota's eyes, the determination in the chief's, and the unwavering spirit of the warriors around him. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everything that had been taken from them and everything that could still be lost. The next morning, the Apache warriors lined up, prepared to face the settlers once more. The land, the very earth beneath their feet, seemed to pulse with the weight of the moment. Thomas stood at the front with Takakota, the rifle in his hands heavier than it had ever been before. They knew that this battle would be different from the last. The settlers were coming in full force, their numbers bolstered by reinforcements from other territories. They had learned from their past mistakes and were determined to win at any cost. But the Apache had something the settlers didn't: the land itself. As the first settlers appeared on the horizon, riding toward the Apache camp, Thomas felt a surge of adrenaline. The sky above was a brilliant blue, the air dry and tense. The Apache were ready. The settlers, though confident, could see the determination in their opponent's eyes. Takakota gave a final look to Thomas, a silent exchange of trust and understanding passing between them. "Remember," Takakota said quietly, "this is our land, and we will not surrender it." The battle began in a blur of movement. Gunfire rang out, the crack of rifles blending with the roar of war cries. The Apache moved swiftly, their bodies fluid and graceful, like shadows in the morning light. Thomas fought alongside them, his rifle steady as he took aim and fired. He was no longer a stranger to this world, no longer just a rancher caught in a fight he didn't choose. He was part of something bigger now. As the battle wore on, the Apache pushed back the settlers, one wave after another. But the settlers weren't easily beaten. They fought hard, with desperation in their eyes. And just as it seemed the Apache might be gaining the upper hand, a loud cry pierced the air. Thomas turned to see Takakota, his face twisted in pain, clutching his side. A settler's bullet had found its mark. Without thinking, Thomas rushed to his side, pulling him behind cover. "Stay with me, Takakota," Thomas said, his voice tight with fear. Takakota grinned weakly. "I've fought many battles, Thomas. I'm not done yet." But Thomas knew that if Takakota fell, the Apache would lose their leader, and that would mean the end of everything they had fought for. The battle raged on, but in that moment, Thomas realized that the fight was not just about surviving the day. It was about ensuring that the Apache, their culture, and their way of life would endure. They fought for something more than land. They fought for their very existence. The settlers might have the numbers, but the Apache had the spirit. And with that spirit, they would fight until their last breath. The battle seemed to stretch on forever, each moment a blur of chaos and struggle. The air was thick with smoke, the sound of gunfire ringing in the distance, and the war cries of both the Apache and the settlers echoing across the land. Thomas had never experienced anything like this before, yet he felt a deep sense of belonging. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for something much bigger than himself. Takakota had fallen, but his spirit still burned bright within the Apache warriors. They fought not just for their land but for their heritage, their culture, and their future. As the settlers pushed forward with renewed fury, it became clear that this battle would not be easily won. The Apache were outnumbered, their ammunition running low, and the settlers had the advantage of numbers. But the Apache had something the settlers didn't: the land itself. It was their home, and they would defend it at all costs. Despite the pain of losing their comrades and the exhaustion setting in, the Apache warriors held their ground. And in the midst of the battle, Thomas found himself fighting alongside Takakota once again. Takakota, though wounded, had refused to give up. His courage was contagious, and it inspired the warriors around him to fight with even greater determination. The settlers, despite their numbers, began to falter. Their line weakened as the Apache warriors pushed forward, using the land's natural features to their advantage. The tide of the battle began to shift. Thomas fired his rifle with precision, each shot finding its mark, and the Apache warriors followed his lead. Slowly but surely, they drove the settlers back. As the sun began to set, casting a blood-red hue over the battlefield, it was clear that the Apache had won the day. The settlers, beaten and scattered, began to retreat, leaving behind the land they had sought to claim. The Apache had proven that they would not be moved, that their land was not for the taking. The war was not over, but this battle was a victory they would never forget. Takakota, though weakened by his injuries, stood tall among his people. The chief, too, had been gravely wounded, but his eyes shone with pride as he looked at the warriors around him. They had fought with everything they had, and they had won. As the warriors gathered around the campfire that night, Thomas stood with them, his heart swelling with a sense of pride and belonging. He had become a part of something much greater than himself. The Apache had not only reclaimed their land, but had secured their future. And for Thomas, the man who had once sought nothing but solitude, the fight had given him purpose. Takakota approached him, his expression solemn but filled with gratitude. "You fought with us, Thomas," he said quietly. "You didn't have to, but you did. And for that, we are grateful." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. He didn't have the words to explain the bond that had formed between him and these people, but he didn't need to. The battle had spoken for itself. In that moment, Thomas knew that he had found a place where he truly belonged. The Apache would face more challenges ahead, but they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had the land. And that, Thomas realized, was all they needed to survive. As the fire crackled and the warriors sang songs of their ancestors, Thomas looked out over the land they had fought for. The wind whispered through the trees, and the earth seemed to hum with life. The Apache had won this battle, but the true test would come in the days ahead. They would rebuild, they would heal, and they would continue to fight. Because, as Thomas had learned, some battles were worth fighting for, no matter the cost.